Christen, welcome, and take it away. Tell us about yourself and lead us through scaling these portfolio walls.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Chris. I joined Red Hat in January of this year. Prior to that, I had run my own business for consulting with portfolio programming, a lot of agile stuff. Most of my life is actually centered around doing things that I love. The work that I was doing as a consultant prior to having my own business was also in the agile space. And it's not everything that I do. I don't do everything really focused around agile, but I happen to like it because it is so flexible and it allows people to make more real-time, just-in-time decisions. I was attracted to it probably back in the early 2000s when I went to my first certified Scrum Master class while I was working at America Online on the East Coast. Since then, I've done quite a bit of work with managing teams who were doing agile implementations to doing large-scale Fortune 100 and 500 transformational plans and executing on how to get better at what they were doing. And a lot of companies start at different levels, sometimes ground up with the teams, sometimes top down with the management and leadership. I've done a lot of both, and I wouldn't say that one works better than the other. It's really very specific to whatever the company's tolerance is for change, as well as who really is driving the change. But all of it really just pays the bills so I can get on the road and go camping. I'm also a registered pet therapy team with my dog here in the photo, Ripley, who unfortunately she passed away the first week that I joined Red Hat, but I've just adopted another Great Pyrenees who's probably behind me chewing on something she's not supposed to be chewing on, but she's being quiet about it, so we're going to ignore it. And then I do agile stuff on the side too. So there's a lot of stuff that I do basically just to keep doing the things that I love in my life, and this is one of them. And I wanted to share a little bit more after Diane reached out to me. I've done this presentation quite a few times over the last couple of years, both virtually and in person. And people were really curious about what is portfolio really, and what does it take to organize around a portfolio or to develop a portfolio? Because a lot of folks were saying that we really just do a lot of stuff, but it's like a list of things to do, but it's not connected to anything that we understand. And that is actually, unfortunately, very common across the US, at least for the different companies that I've worked with, that trying to build a portfolio process and identify the people who are responsible for that portfolio is often a misstep. It's sort of forgotten. Or as they're trying to do something in a more agile way, there's a clash between traditional project management and portfolio management and what agile is trying to do. So I thought we would start off with just definitions, because sometimes when we say those words, we think we know what we're talking about, but there's often a lot of differences in how we describe them or how we use them in our company. So when someone says program or project or portfolio, you might not actually be describing the same thing. If you talk to one company and another company, or sometimes even two people in the same company. So I was curious to find out here at Red Hat if you're also having some difficulties with trying to scale beyond a team and then start using that terminology to help you start defining things in a common way. So first question is, do you know what these acronyms are? PMO, PPMO, projects, programs, and portfolios. Does everyone feel like, oh yeah, I know what these mean? And we can use show of hands or whatever other mechanism we have in Blue Jeans, even in the chat, which I'm not necessarily following, but I think Diane can probably interject if we see any comments about it. So if you were to go to the experts, and when I say experts, I'm talking about Google and Alexa. When you ask, hey, Alexa, what is a PMO? Then you will find things like this. PMO is supposed to be Project Management Office. PPMO is Project Portfolio Management Office. Projects are temporary. They're supposed to undertake some sort of unique product, service, or result. It has a definitive start and dates associated with that. And programs are a group of projects that are similar or related. And then portfolios, as you go up, are a group of sometimes different programs or projects within the same organization. And they are roughly related or unrelated to one another, but have a global strategy to maximize the ROI. So immediately, with that last underlined phrase, I would say there's something that we probably need to pay attention to if we're talking about how portfolios are grouping different programs with a common global strategy. And then what is the return on investment? Well, if you go to PMI, who traditionally for the last probably 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, they would say that portfolio management is ideally in place to ensure that the organization can leverage its project selection and the execution success to achieve strategic objectives. And their research has shown that portfolio management is a way to bridge the gap between that strategy and the implementation. So just based on that, what do you think the necessary inputs would be if that's what we need to do? What's the gap? And then what are the necessary inputs? What do you think it is? I'm going to try and look at the chat. Customer input, okay. Market awareness, possibly. Strategy. Yes, Philippe, that's it. We need strategy. If we don't have a strategy, then how do we know all of these projects are actually connected? If we start with a strategy, then we're talking about now that we have it, what do we need to do? What are the different parts of the business or the organization that need to take action? Not every strategic goal impacts every single organization in your company. Sometimes they do, but not always. So to scale across the organization, that set of strategies or the single strategy, depending on how large your organization is, we then need to talk about how do we scale that to make it successful. And just for a little bit of fun, I thought we would talk about some scaling successes here. And just watch and comment on how successful is this child at scaling. And yes, there is a padded bottom. It is a toddler. All of the necessary precautions and safeties were taken into account. So it's obvious that the child knows that there's a goal, there's a strategy here. Now watch, even from behind without seeing the facial expressions. There's a little bit of a, let's try this. Nope, that's not gonna work. I'll try something else. And that would be what we would call a stretch goal. And she made it. And she's still going. Getting some reassurance. Yes, delete problem solving. That's exactly right. And you may not be able to hear it, but there's not a whole lot of conversation between the parents and the child right now in this facility where they're doing the rock climbing. Getting a little easier. Oh, almost a fumble. Oh, look at that. Oh, that's quad strength right there. Look at that. And, oh, it's that last part. Isn't it always the last part of your project that seems to be the most difficult? Yes. And, oh, it's right on the toes. Not quite. A little bit more reassurance. And, oh, we're so close. Ah, there we go. And success. And probably going to run back down to the bottom and do it again. Now, in comparison, let's look at some, well, we're not really doing so great on this one. Sorry for the trying to get through it real quick. What you get for not paying for their service, right? Here we go.
We'll take a look at the vista here and then come back, see how Paul's doing on that hill. That descent. There he is. He's holding on for dear life. Look at him. You can do it. Rock climber extraordinaire. Paul Terrian.
We're walking with you, encouraging you.
The cliff is eating Gabby.
Oh,
Alice, are you stuck? What happened? Uh-oh.
Put both hands on the rope button.
Kick off with your feet.
still working on their technique.
Okay, we're videotaping still.
Just do it. Jump out.
Oh my God. Sit down. So why do you think we're sharing these success and failures of scaling? Any ideas? Yep. You have to keep going. Yep. Sometimes we don't have a complete strategy. We're not knowing exactly where we're going. There was a couple where some folks were thinking they knew exactly what to do and they ended up failing miserably, but they probably went back up and tried again. The idea is that we don't all know how to do this so perfectly that nothing ever fails, that everything always happens perfectly. And I think that is something that is somehow permeated the entire world, frankly, that if you try something, it has to be right the first time. And that is so not true. And it is so beyond what we should be expecting from each other. We don't expect perfection. We expect to give it a shot, try, and then see what worked and what didn't work, and then fix it. It's funny that the video we showed of the success was a toddler who probably can't even complete full sentences quite yet, and yet still had the tenacity to continue to go and find a new place to put her footing or a new place to put her hands, and then got to the top and didn't really make a big deal and probably went right back down to do it again. So there's a tenacity that young people have that I wish more of us in the adult world, frankly, had, is that we have permission to fail and we have permission to give something a try, but to keep going. And that's really the message I was hoping to share with all of you. And then to also acknowledge what are the challenges that you face when you are trying to build a portfolio process within your company, or even if you're just trying to build a portfolio within your line of business within Red Hat. So if you're not familiar with Mentimeter, you can either go to this website and plug in this code, but I would actually recommend just take your phone, open up the camera app on your phone, and point it at the screen. And it will automatically notice this barcode and give you a link to open it up in whatever browser that your phone has. Plug in what you think the challenges are. And I think this thing is actually giving me a different link, so I apologize. I just checked this, it took a second ago. So you might have to use the code. I apologize. Something's going on with Mentimeter, it's going to a different place. So I'll give you a moment for that. And I'm actually going to launch this so we can see the results. There we go. So now think about the way that your organization is structured. And I'm going to go back to the question that's posed. What do you think are the challenges you experience right now within Red Hat to build out a solid portfolio process that manages the intake priorities and strategies down through to the teams that are actually doing the day-to-day activity? And plug those into the chat. And you should be able to, after you finish asking the first question and submit it, there's a link to go to the second slide. You can also use that too. There we go. Alignment, communication, strategy, manager direction, fragmented work, prioritization, timing of releases, yep. So these are common, right? How many of you worked in other companies where they had all of this perfectly aligned and there were absolutely no problems? Probably not too many. And if you did have that, it's probably because they did a lot of work to get there. So when we talk about how do you get there, that's really what I was kind of hoping to share with you all today, is some of my own experience with how did we move a company to a portfolio strategy and connect all the work that the teams were doing. It doesn't happen on its own. There needs to be people who believe in it. There needs to be people who are willing to put time and effort into making it happen, because we need the collaboration of ideas from both the business and the technology leaders to be incorporated into that portfolio. And sometimes they just need help to focus, as well as the place to be able to negotiate, as well as building a portfolio management system that creates alignment. Oops, something's going on. Somebody have their volume on? I'm sure, I don't know if you guys are hearing music, but I'm hearing music. Anyway, here is an agenda that I have used in the past to help people start planning on how to implement a portfolio strategy. The prep that we need to do is to identify who are the right people who need to show up for this event. It's usually a day or two. And we need to interview them ahead of time to find out what is it that they believe will describe success of implementing a portfolio, as well as what challenges they anticipate, so that you as an organizer or facilitator, you're able to pull this together. And then communicate the agendas ahead of time so that they're aware of what are the necessary people, excuse me, who are the necessary people and what are the necessary steps that need to be addressed while they're in the session. You want decision makers. You don't want folks who are just going to show up as a proxy and then not be able to make any decisions. Otherwise, you're going to end up with multiple meetings, one after the other. The session itself typically would include the next 4 things on the list. One is mapping out the value stream, which, if you're not familiar with that, Karen Martin, and I can't remember the other author's name, wrote a really effective book about value stream mapping. It is not necessarily tied directly to Agile, but is a very complementary tool for a lot of Agile folks. It is meant to, in this session, to map out what they currently do, not what they want to do. They're going to definitely want to start correcting things and making changes and fixing all the problems that they already know they have. But as a facilitator, you want to kind of pull that in and say, parking lot, those great ideas, it's definitely something you want to look at. But right now, we're trying to map out, what do we currently do? How does work come in? What are the triggers for new work and ideas? Who provides those and where do they come from? What tools do they use to communicate it? Is it Post-it notes? Is it Jira? Is it AHA? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it some sort of a customer service application that you use where customers submit their requests through that pipeline? That, plus all the steps to when do we answer their requests, and we put those ideas out into production, and they are now outcomes. So ideas to outcomes, or what most people are familiar with, is concept to cash. So what is that cycle from end to end for the company, or if it's a subset of the company, the organization, or the business unit? Then we want to identify what are the decision-making models we will use to just say, you know, there's 500 things we just got. We can't do all of them right now. So what decision-making model are we using to say yes or no, or probably just not yet, to all of those requests coming in? It also has an economic element to it, which is why we call it an economic decision-making model. And then we also evaluate all of the work against the effort to get the work done, and then capture the current work that's already in flight in what we call a portfolio Kanban, so that then they can see, here's all the work that you already have in flight right now, and let's go back and look at all the decisions that we just made about what we should say yes or no to, and apply them to stuff that's in flight. Should we have started those? Or should we actually cancel those projects possibly, or delay them? Because there's some more important things that we've already identified using the economic decision-making model that tells us that we actually made some incorrect choices on what we decided to put money into. And then the close is a consensus on all the attendees, the cadence, and the agenda for any portfolio review meetings that you're going to have in the future. So just a rough sample of what that planning session might look like. And if you are interested in doing something like this, we provided a kickoff summary that helps you sort of take a template and then refine it for what you might need for your own business unit, or organization. I'm not going to go into detail, and I believe Diane is going to share a PDF version of the whole slide, so you'll be able to get to this later, but highlighted all the things that will change based on what your organization wants to focus on. So those interviews that I mentioned earlier, those are inputs into the development of this kickoff summary. So what are the key findings that I found during the interviews? These are the things that we want to address by having portfolio planning put in place. And then the limit of scope of what's in or out, we list that, and then the cadence of meetings is proposed that we have business steering, quarterly planning, and system demos, things like that. And you would refine that to the language within your own company. And I admit, these are terms that I've used for probably the last 8 years. In Red Hat, I've already seen that there's different terms that we use, so obviously we would have to change that internally. Now, going back to who gets invited, depending on the span of portfolio management's responsibility, if you're doing a whole company, then you can imagine a lot of these folks need to be included. If you're only doing a subset of the company, then you might not want such high-level folks like COOs and CTOs. You might have their direct reports, or possibly even further down into the management level. But this is just a starting point that you might want to draw the line of, like, how far and wide are we going with this portfolio implementation. Now, mapping out the current process. I will tell you that having done value stream mapping in different ways over the last 5 or so years, specifically with some of these big companies across the globe, it is really hard to get people to understand the value of doing this together in a room with all of the people who represent sales, marketing, business, engineering, as well as quality assurance or quality folks, because they tend to think, well, I already know what it is. Just send, this operations person off and sit in a room with them and they'll come up with it. The purpose is not just to map out the value stream, but also to get agreement from all of those individuals that that is actually the way that work does get done. Because what often happens is by writing it out and starting to pull out certain things about here's where we make this decision or this decision or this decision, there's a lot of aha moments where people will say things like, I didn't know we did that. Or things like, there is no way we do that. That's stupid. I've actually had a VP literally say those very words, because he was recognizing that he was not aware that we were doing a certain step as part of the intake of new work. But we all agreed, yeah, we don't like that we do this either, but that is actually what we're asking people to do today. So immediately they were recognizing not only places where they could improve it, but they were also recognizing the disparity of their understanding of how work got done. So there's the value of common understanding and visibility about the whole process across the company or within the division, and a very, very honest discussion about, well, that should change. We can be so much more efficient if we remove that step or make it simplified. So even while we're only talking about the as-is process, we're also starting to see people go, oh yeah, now I know why it takes so long to get stuff done here, because we're doing all these extra steps or we're doing things that are just not that efficient. So this is really good for us to be able to help people understand it. And I actually will answer the question I think Diane is posing, how my perception has changed since joining Red Hat. My perception about value stream mapping or about what?
Well, what I'm just going to pose it this way, is that since joining Red Hat, most of the Red Hat projects and products also incorporate people external to Red Hat, not just Red Hat PMs and engineers and sales, or and even customers, but this whole other layer of upstream projects, and trying to incorporate how we do all that. And I'm just curious, when maybe now, since we've interrupted you and you worked up, how if it has changed or hasn't changed. You know, it's still the same process. It's just this other set of requirements and things to negotiate.
Well, I'd say my first initial reaction is it has not changed, because I think there's a lot of similarities between what Red Hat does and this particular customer that I worked with, excuse me. If you'll notice here, it's a little bit hard to read, but there's a section here of triggers. We have business themes where they are generating their own work and ideas of what they think their customers will want, but they also have a pipeline that they called it their innovation pipeline, and this was where customers were telling salespeople, or customers were doing their own requests to us directly and saying, well, we want this. And so we would compare, what does the business internally to the company think the customers want, and what is the customer actually saying they want? And in that way, I kind of compare that to what we do at Red Hat. We've got an internally product management driven backlog and strategic goals, but we also have an upstream community that's also telling us something possibly different, but they are getting merged at some point, which is exactly what this company needed to do, is they had a separate team of developers that were mostly architects and senior designers who were taking all of the customer requests, pulling together design solutions, putting together project plans, and then throwing it over the fence to the same team who was working on the business themes and saying, here's some more work. But they were never coordinating the priority of that pipeline and the business pipeline, but it was the same team doing the work, or I should say teams, because it was quite a few hundred people. So I think there's a lot of similarities with Red Hat and this company. So I would say the short answer is it doesn't change my perception so far.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting stage in the pipeline. So you were talking about customers there and customer interests and upstream interest at being at the sort of the front end or the beginning of that set of arrows. But it's the work effort, like trying to coordinate with upstream projects to get the things that you need done up there that I think impacts this in an interesting way, or just adds another layer to it at Red Hat, because yes, some of the upstream folks have stuff, but in order to get something, say, into Kubernetes that we need for a customer request at the end of your pipeline, there's a lot of even more stakeholders and negotiations that have to go on.
Right, right. Well, and the answer, or a way, I should say, because there's so many different answers on how to get that intake incorporated into plans that teams develop solutions and deliver on those, is we came up with a portfolio canvas together. And what you'll see is there's 3 stages here. The left-hand side is the strategic things, the economic decision-making model, and their budget. And I won't talk too much in detail because we won't have enough time about all of this, but I'm going to skip to the right-hand side and say that the strategic things and decision-making model and budget are all the things you have to have in place before you get started on work. Once you've delivered that work, you're also going to take the themes and provide some performance metrics on, did we actually achieve a percentage of those goals? Did we make progress? Because usually strategic themes take several years to accomplish the goal that was designed as an outcome. So we're managing that on a cadence as well. So as throughput is coming through, we take themes and we measure. And how is that progressing over time? Are we reaching those goals? The economic decision-making model is also measured through value measurements. So we are establishing different type of measurements to say, well, we thought that if we made this decision that we would increase or decrease a certain element within our business, like lower our cost or increase our customer value or whatever those are. So now we're measuring that over time. Budget, then we also look at, well, we said we were going to spend X number of dollars. How much did we actually spend and how much did we acquire, or what was our revenue? So this is the ROI piece of it. So those are the 2 sides that are always being measured. And if the things on the left change over time, then we also have to reevaluate our metrics and where we expect our thresholds to be. And now I'm going to focus on the center part, which is the guts of it. This is the sausage making. So we took the value stream and we said, okay, well, this is what we do. And we did collapse the value stream of the customer and community into the pipeline. Instead of having them as 2 separate ones, we actually collapsed them together because we realized it's all flowing to the same delivery people. So we needed to make sure it was all funneling through a single prioritized list of work rather than two that were always competing. Like they have a number one and we have a number one. So which is the number one? Neither of them are. So it's the whole, if everything is an emergency, nothing's an emergency. That's the whole premise of that. So we took the what, we mapped that out, and then we started to discover who is involved in each of the stages. And we didn't put the names, we put the roles, because the roles were more important. We didn't need names because that wouldn't make sense. We wanted this to be able to survive even when people were moving and getting promoted and all of that. And then we also started to look at the tooling aspect and the data of how are we communicating that information and what level of detail is necessary at each stage of the process while it's going through the stream. So when we're still talking to customers, who's involved and what are they expected to develop? And this particular company was using Rally software. Some of their development teams were using Jira. And so we said, well, there's a lot of different language across those different tools, but within this time frame, we should at least have the initiatives confirmed and approved, as well as any of the other things that are in other systems called projects or epics or a contract, because this particular customer did a lot of work that was contract based. They were contracted to do work and they were driving some of their own internal work. So all of that language had to be mapped out, like where does that survive in this or show up in this process. Then once you get to this part of the process, that's when we're starting to detail what they call capabilities, which is a little bit higher level than a feature. Once you get to this process, then for each of the initiatives or capabilities, we have how many features are involved and the user stories and so forth. For the portfolio Kanban system, we needed to also map out how are those being managed, what are the flows, like when it starts in as an idea, then it becomes a business case, then it's prioritized, then we build it, then we start measuring it, and then we archive it because we're done. But this is at the initiative level, which is why it's an I something, I number 12, idea number, initiative number 13. The second step is once we get to capabilities, then we're breaking those initiatives down into capabilities. Those have a different workflow and they map up through the initiatives. And then once we get to this stage, we're starting to develop the feature backlog. And those features are also associated to maybe one or more capabilities and so forth. So we wanted to try to map out not only the value stream and the who does what, but also how does this get added into our set of tools so that we're managing the progress of an idea all the way through development is actually started on that work, as well as testing and any of the other work that has to be done before it's pushed into production. And so we took this canvas and started to break down the left-hand side. So we said, all right, what are the economic decision-making models and frameworks that we want to use consistently for any new thing that comes through the system? So they developed their own, and I had to black out some of this because it was confidential with this particular customer with some names and things like that. But they also associated that with their budget. And within their area, they actually had a certain dollar amount that was allocated for that business unit. And then they had to decide of that dollar amount, how much of that is going to be spent on product development versus that we drive internally versus customer requests versus just keeping the lights on. And the RTS is just an acronym that they use for something like that. Then we sat down and looked at prioritization, because what we were finding is that there were so many projects in flight that nothing was getting done. Sound familiar? It is a very common problem. So we said, all right, we're going to have the business and technologies actually separate into two groups. First, we're going to ask the business to stand in front of this big, huge poster, and we didn't have enough wall space, so we had to put it on a table. And the left line, the y-axis, is the low to high cost or effort to get something done. And the bottom x-axis from left to right is low to high value to the business. So we asked the business, could you take all of these projects, which are represented by those yellow stickies, and you're just going to move them from left to right and compare them relative value-wise. Move it all the way to the right if it's the highest value project on this whole list. Move it to the left by comparison of how much lower in value that is. But you cannot move it up or down. You can only move it left or right. Then we had them move to the side, and then the technology folks moved to the front of the table, and we told them, you cannot move it left or right. You can only move it up or down. And the result was we were seeing the circular lines showed low cost, high value things really should be the first things that we tackle because they're big wins. And then as you start going out in those concentric circles up and to the left, it is a high cost and a lower value that will probably be lower priority. We used this to then go back to our portfolio Kanban to say, all right, now take those same projects and put them into where they are currently in flight. Should we not have worked on some of them? Do we want to cancel any of those? Because if we compare where they showed up on the priority list and what we actually are doing, sometimes we were identifying, and almost 50% of the time we were identifying that it was a lot of work that we really never should have started, that we should have delayed and done later because the value was not high or the effort was too high compared to the value. Now we also added these, and some people use exit criteria as a term, and we did not use that for this exercise. We just said that when a card at the initiative level or project level is currently, let's say, in progress, like people are building solutions for it right now, that means that all of these things are being done, and all of these things have already been done. So it was basically like a checklist of before we can pull it into the next state of the portfolio Kanban, we need to make sure that these things are finished. And we also identified templates and documentation and people who were responsible for doing those things as it progressed through the Kanban system. And I won't go into a ton of detail, but if you're familiar with Kanban, excuse me, and the pull system, it is based on you never push something into a state. You wait until the people who are in that state have the capacity to pull it. That includes engineers, but it also includes portfolio folks who are managing this Kanban, because engineers really don't get involved heavily until you get to the build state, but they need to know what the priorities are so that as they identify what they're capable of doing in the next cadence of work, maybe they're doing quarterly delivery models or something similar to that, then they can tell the business, you've got 50 things that are prioritized, we're going to pick up the top 5 for the next quarter. And so we move those into a build state. And when they tell us at the portfolio level, those 5 things are now finished, then we move it into the measurement and we start using the metrics that we've agreed to with them to start measuring it there. So this is where I was hoping we would have some time for people to talk through what role they think they play with the portfolio, and maybe it's nothing, it's just an awareness and you're curious about it, or it could be, oh, I'm actually in the portfolio area and I need to do some of this stuff, and to talk about what are those challenges that you're facing and what part of the portfolio planning steps that we've described so far might be helpful to you, and why would they be helpful to you. And knowing we have a smaller audience, we don't necessarily need to go into separate breakout rooms, but if we have the capability to turn on microphones for folks and just have a discussion together, that would be great.
No, this is great, and I'll offer to anyone here, if you want to unmute yourselves and join in this conversation now. We'll take a short pause here before we go on with the presentation. But this has been, it's really interesting. I've done this so many iterations of this task, and so it's really nice to see it laid out this way. So thanks, Christen, for taking the time to do this today. And there's so many different roles that I think I've played over the ages at Red Hat and at other companies in this. But now, in a lot of ways, I'm just the observer because I'm on the open source side of things. So I'm seeing, I get to bring the upstream story to the table when we do these portfolio exercises. But a lot of the times, I'm just really the person that's trying to understand how the decisions were made.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how about other folks on the phone? Are any of you actively on a portfolio management team and you're managing a portfolio?
Look, listening to people are being a little shy here. Let me see in the chat if anyone's asking adding anything, but I think they're being a little shy today. So I think that's one of the things is there's actually quite a few Red Hatters on, which is really fun because this is also an external facing thing. So sometimes you get the interplay of that, but I think today is very tilting towards the Red Hat side. And a lot of folks, I think, are just learning these processes too. They're new to it, and this is part of the skill set that we need to share, so we have a common vocabulary across all of the different business units and portfolio decision-making processes, and this is really helpful for that.
Yeah, Mac, thank you very much for the structured insight to how we need to think about this, right? And I think linking back to some of the questions that came up earlier around how this pertains to Red Hat and especially with community being open source roots driving a different model for development for most of our life, right? But then I do want to sort of like give the other side of it. The extent to which that we are dependent on community contributions varies quite a lot based on the maturity of the product, right? So if we take, say, for instance, many of our RHEL base, right? That's mostly a community-led project, and we are very beholden to what happens to the community in terms of what we do. But then for some of those products that we acquire and then open source, the contributions that we make almost 100% of the output of that work, and we have a lot of those in our stable of products right now. So the needle, fluctuates depending on what we are talking about, right? If you take something that's like Ceph or something like that we acquired 6-7 years ago, and where that is right now, has probably shifted in terms of what the level of community influence is in that versus when we first acquired that project, right? So I think it varies, but I think one of the things that I see in the planning approach that we are talking about down here is that we do want to have that blend of customer input or market-facing input and economic decision-making being applied in terms of where should we put the emphasis on, and then figure out what we need to do in terms of negotiating and modulating what we can do with the things that less out of the control, right? The community will also gravitate towards things that are of higher value if that is where they know that the emphasis, long-term emphasis or strategic direction is. I think the challenge, though, is articulating it in terms of a strategic imperative that is backed by economic data or market opportunity data or addressable market, and so on, right? And I think that's the kind of upfront work that we need to do to drive this process effectively. And then thinking about how we do a lot of these things in Red Hat is, and some of us already talk about portfolio and building the portfolio roadmaps and all of those kinds of things. What we are doing is very much trying to link existing work that we do into what we think the strategy is and trying to build an association which is not clearly thing. It's almost like maybe it should have been an output of the planning process, but just as we have rolled up the stuff that is in the community and made products out of it, we are caught in that transitional phase, right? So at the top level where portfolio planning is done, I would be very, very honest and blunt and say that I have actually no idea how those decisions are being made, because I don't see the market analysis documents that are driving that decision making, except if I read trade press, right? Then it becomes like a lot more clear to me why we are going after certain markets or what the market opportunity beyond those things are, right? And then that talks to how do you make those trade-offs, and do we have the alignment between the biggest market opportunities and the the place where we are spending the most amount of our execution effort in delivering content.
Yeah.
Well,
Luckily,
and what you
yeah.
were just mentioning about having visibility to prioritization and the process of doing that, that was one of the really important things that I started to think about for Red Hat, is we're open source for so many things. Why wouldn't we be open source on our own decision-making models on when we decide to do something or not to do something? So I think not only internally should that be well known and understood, but possibly even externally.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because we have the open organization book and we have an open culture, and a lot of this, luckily for me, from the position where I'm in community development, but tied into the cloud platform BU very tightly, I get to see all of that. Like, but and I think I'm a bit of an influencer in some of that stuff. I'm not sure. I didn't think I saw my title in any of those lists, but I think my voice gets heard a lot, and I get to see a lot of that decision. But it's interesting. I think one of the biggest challenges we have at Red Hat is we have a huge number of products and a number of portfolios, and the decision-making process, it's a hard thing to communicate, and I think that's the biggest challenge I have is one, keeping up with what's in all the portfolios, let alone why we're there. And I think every large organization has that. I don't think that's unique at all to Red Hat, but the communication process is it's sometimes overwhelming, Dilip, how many things that, we're talking about edge now, and then there's a whole conversation about data science, and there's, the telco space, and then there's healthcare, and then there's just the core infrastructure pieces. And then, there's so many moving pieces that, and it goes back to the comment I made earlier, is that having this common language for discussing it, and maybe even a common set of documentation, because I think, and I'm not trying to be critical of Red Hat, but it's been in every organization I've ever worked in, is that every silo has their own processes for this and their own way of documenting it. And very rarely do you come across a company where the entire company is using the exact same process.
Right.
And so you're always
less than 200 people.
Yeah, well, and they certainly don't have as many as IBM or Red Hat.
Nice.
And that might have been the startups I was in before I came, where you knew everybody and everyone and what they were working on. And so the bigger the organization, the harder this task is.
Yeah. Well, and I know we're almost at the 10 minutes before the top of the hour, so I just wanted to close us out with something that was really helpful to me in my career, and that is to remember that even when you fall in the mud scaling that wall, make sure you're just not alone. Our group of warriors, we did the Spartan race in Northern Virginia quite a few years ago as a team building event, and as you can see, the before and after, we still have smiles. We didn't all go at the same pace. We all finished at the end of the race at different times, but we were all at the finish line for each other. And that is the part that makes this work. There's so many cliches out there, teamwork makes the dream work, and people just roll their eyes. They're like, okay. But if we don't figure out how to do this together, it won't feel like we crossed the finish line and reached the goals together. So that's the most important thing that I've learned, is that don't try to push through all this stuff on your own. Gather other people who also want to make a change work and figure out a way to do it together. And bring all the right folks into the room, which is why I listed so many people across the organization, because the tendency is that we just do engineering, or we just do business and engineering, but we forget marketing, sales, and finance have a part of this. We're all part of a family trying to make a business run. And without considering their needs and what they will do to support us, the give and take that we give to each other, it won't work well. We'll end up forgetting stuff. We'll end up taking some missteps. So if you can start out grabbing the right folks and saying, I want to partner with you. I want you to be part of this team so we can make this work together, a lot more people will be willing to start having the tough discussions about what we need to change.
I'd also add in and it's not just an internal focus too. At Red Hat, we have partners and GSIs and ISVs and end users and open source upstream people. So it makes the network of communications about this and the people that we're incorporating in these conversations really, sometimes it's quite amazing, the things that we can do together when we do collaborate and we do it in the open and we have a common language. So I am incredibly appreciative of you taking the time today to walk us through all of this, and to Leap for joining us and making this happen. So this has been really interesting for me, and I'm just going to leave with one anecdote. When we here in British Columbia and Canada do this mud race, we have to carry a keg. So it's called the mud kegger. I don't know if you did was this keg beer, and then if you make it to the end, you drop the keg and drink it, or you get a chilled keg. It's a slightly different variation on that mud wrestling kind of vision.
That just takes things to a whole nother level.
Spend some time in Canada.
Yeah, everybody gets to come to the mud kegger here when the COVID is over. So yeah, we're all invited.
I accept.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Diane. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
All right, and I put the link to the slides in the chat, so if anyone's looking for them there, and I'll post this video up on our YouTube channel shortly as well, and tweet it out under the OpenShift Commons Twitter handle later today. So thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Everybody, I hope you're recuperating from KubeCon EU. I know Chris Short, our producer, a big shout out to him because he's been up since I think 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. My time. I don't even know. I think he's in Central Time Zone. I'm in Pacific. We've all been had a great week. This was a great way to end KubeCon week. So perfect. We learned so much at KubeCon, and now we know how to put it together and use it to influence the portfolio development process.